the University of Arkansas Rome Center. We're here with Francesco Galtieri, who is the head of the Office of the United Nations Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Syria. Which basically means, would you like to tell us what it is that you do in Syria at the moment?
Sure, and thank you for hosting me. So the United Nations have in every country a presence and a representation of the different agencies, funds and programs that deliver humanitarian assistance or socioeconomic development aid. And so the work of all the UN system in these countries is coordinated by a representative of the Secretary General that we call the resident coordinator. And of course he or she has an office supporting, and I'm the chief of staff to that office to try and make the UN presence in Syria smoothly operating and assisting people.
This week marks 10 years of the crisis in Syria. We obviously hear and read news from a variety of international media outlets. I'm more curious to hear from someone who lives on the ground and witnesses from the ground, what is the situation? Can you tell us the difference, what it means to work in a war or post-war zone or in a prolonged crisis country, as opposed to what does change mean in a classic development? What does growth mean there?
You know, when we think about ourselves, what we wish for our lives, for our family and relatives' lives, we always think about how necessary it is to not only respond to the basic needs of food, security, safety, education, health, an opportunity to fulfill our hopes in a job or through a career or building a family. And this path towards a regular life is what everybody is looking for. Of course, when we look at countries that have gone through a crisis, might that be a major natural shock or a man-made crisis, like a political crisis that turns into violence. I mean, those factors represent a sort of a pulling back series of elements in people's aspiration towards a fulfilling and dignified life. That means also equality across the different social classes, across the different population groups. And so the major difference is that in what we would call a regular development context, the social contract, the level of cohesion within a society, within a community, is much more stable, and therefore there is a greater common vision and a common agenda towards which the society works. While in countries that are torn by a crisis, what happens is that we need to first and foremost help those people find and define that common vision towards which to work. And very often that requires healing the difficulties and the disputes that groups have been having, either in order to compete for resources or just to stand up for their ideas and values in a way that at a certain point broke the dialogue and turned into a more confrontational and sometimes violent way of interacting. In fact, you're right when you mention the 10 years, because this kind of searches for what does it really mean for people to live through a crisis for such a long time. And of course, crises tend to transform themselves. And as in the case of Syria, it started as a political crisis, but then there have been added layers to this crisis. And that's why nowadays we tend to talk about Syria representing a compounded crisis, because it has the political element, it has the economic element, it has still some elements of violence, and such a large number of people living in a dire situation depending on humanitarian assistance. Therefore, when we talk with the people, what the 10 years means to them is mostly the question, when is this going to end? And how long is it going to take for us as a country to recover after such a long time, because we shouldn't forget that Syria used to be a country with a high level of education, a middle-income country in the Middle Eastern area, that was a country of destination also for many Western students to learn Arabic. So it is a country that has lost its track somehow over the 10 years, and that's meaningful for a society that has kind of seen its journey interrupted for such a long time.
In fact, Syria was, I mean, it's got a long history up to when you're mentioning more modern times. Was originally one of the signatory of the UN Charter, it's one of the founding members of the United Nations. And the way you explained sort of the tragic outcome of this last 10 years made me think of the difference of what it means to, development is always change. It always means some kind of progress and planting seeds that will hopefully one day grow into a beautiful tree and meadow. But it must be very different to work in a humanitarian emergency, prolonged crisis or post-conflict or active war country, as opposed to a sort of classic development scenario. Or classic development country, can you explain to our viewers how that is structured, what difference there is?
Sure, when we think of the United Nations, the organization was established to promote cooperation across the people. So the Charter, differently from other international treaties, does not start with the sentence, we the member states, or we the parties to this treaty. It starts with the sentence, we the peoples of the United Nations. And so this sense of international cooperation, it is meant to have the different member states and countries mutually helping each other to advance the socio-economic development agenda, meaning providing everyone with the dignity of a life where they can access education, health, opportunities to fulfill their hopes and wishes for themselves, for their families, for their country, their communities at large. Of course, when crises occur, and that could be either a natural disaster like a big earthquake or a tsunami, or a man-made crisis like in the case of Syria, this journey towards attempting to pursue a better life for a community is suddenly stopped by a shock. And so before that journey can resume, the causes of the shock needs to be addressed, but also the impact that that shock has on people, on their daily lives, on the opportunity to wake up in the morning and feeling safe, having a chance to send the kids to school. And so the major difference of operating in an ongoing and protracted crisis country versus operating in a politically stable and economically, let's say, at least promising, if not wealthy country, is that people in a stable country tend to work towards a shared vision, to share the resources also, for example, try to balance off inequalities. While people who live through a period of crisis, maybe a protracted crisis over a multiple number of years, and beyond Syria we can think of Yemen, of the Democratic Republic of Congo, many other countries, first have to heal the fracture, the level of social fragmentation that made different parties in a society compete for something. And sometimes it is competing about resources, sometimes it is competing about values, to a point of maybe rich violent confrontation as an alternate means to dialogue and listening and cooperation. So the United Nations, being a convener of this type of space and agenda, we need to adjust the way we bring people around a common vision, and also adjust how we use the means that are given by the member states to accompany these people and the communities.
One of the programs that we've recently launched at the University of Arkansas, it's called the Arkansas Global Changemakers, and it deals a lot, obviously, what you've explained about what development really is. So it made me think of words like development as change, or innovation. And especially when you mention we, the people of the United Nations, we're really focused on how sustainable development as a deep, meaningful change works and functions, like it really tilts the needle of change if it comes from the community, from grassroots, from bottom up, as opposed to imposed in some. What are your thoughts or experience about this?
You know, development is a journey, right? That is probably cyclical for people, for their communities, for the families, and that is why people's aspirations are often built on what their parents or their grandparents or their areas of origins, their community of origins have lived through, right? And so I guess the fundamental issue is that development is always about the people. And also the Sustainable Development Agenda, that is the agenda for the next, I mean, it was established for 15 years and now we have 10 years left of this journey, is what we call a people-centered agenda. Sure. Because there is no action that walks away from people's legs and arms and will and knowledge. And so it is extremely important to realize at the individual level that even the largest societal change starts with people and starts with the way people engage in what they stand for, starts with the way people talk to each other or are able to listen to each other. And so having programs associated to an education institution like a university that promote change through people by accompanying, you know, the development of knowledge and the competences of listening to each other, of asking the right questions, is extremely important. You know, what we are seeing these days in the Sustainable Development Agenda, if we take, for example, the environmental aspects and the global Fridays for Future movement, is that few very young people, so who have a long future hopefully ahead of them, have started asking themselves the right questions and impose those questions to the international public opinion. So I really believe that every opportunity provided by a program or an institution to engage individuals and create a community around those individuals and a common vision to pursue is going to help this world get a better place, and a place that is more sustainable in the sense that it is more equitable in the use of resources today to leave something for the people tomorrow.
I agree in that they are extraordinary. These, you know, young people, the Friday movement, environmental, they are asking the right questions and they're managing to making themselves heard, which hasn't been really that easy before. And so following from this, one word that we hear a lot, the new hip or buzzword, is resilience. Now, in a country that is affected by a deep, prolonged crisis, such as Syria or other countries, Yemen, you mentioned a few, unfortunately, too many in 2021. What does it mean? Resilience can be obviously used in many different contexts, but I'm curious to hear your opinion of what does it mean where people really suffer, where the daily issues are deep, deep problems. What does resilient mean? Are there any examples of programs you're working on that you can mention?
Yes, and thanks for asking that question, because unfortunately sometimes words that become buzzwords lose their meaning. And so many people end up using them without really thinking what's behind that. When I think of resilience, I always go back to the original meaning of the word that comes from physics, the physics of the material. And so a resilient material is a material that absorbs a shock, adjusts to the consequences of the shock, and then adapts to the situation that is created after the shock has been imposed on that piece of wood or any other form of material. And so for the society, resilience becomes a very similar concept. Is the inner strength or those resources around us that we hook on as a peg after a shock First, to absorb what happened to us unexpectedly, then to adjust and define, okay, now that I was hit by a shock, how do I imagine tomorrow? The day after I ran away from a building that collapsed following an earthquake, how do I think of myself and my family tomorrow? And then adapt. How do I engage in reconstruction of my house that the earthquake destroyed? And so when we apply this concept, of course, to a natural disaster, it is much easier for communities to imagine themselves rebuilding, because natural disasters are taken as an act of God in many, or
right.
as something that cannot be prevented, right? That you can prepare for, but you cannot avoid to live through. It is different when the concept of resilience is adapted to man-made crisis, because that shock comes from the inability of actors within a community to stop their disagreement before it is too late, before it turns into aggression, into violence. And you know, we often hear that conflict is part of life. Of course, I mean, the most simple form of conflict is disagreement. We all live through disagreement every day. It doesn't mean that we always constantly transform that disagreement into aggression. And so when that happens, people are not only physically threatened or harmed, but also deep inside, they are touched as human beings in somebody disrespecting their dignity or denying them a basic right like food or schooling for their children and so on. And so the same way after a natural shock, we try as United Nations, as this international community, to accompany communities to the first phase of absorbing a shock, to the phase of adjusting and imagining how to have this new birth after that shock, all the way to adapt to the new situation. Our programs mirror a little bit the same journey, again, because the human life is a constant journey. And so the programs and the assistance we provide closer to those manifestations of a shock, of violence, of aggression in a man-made political crisis are the basic inputs for people to cope with their daily life, distributing food or organizing classrooms for kids in places where maybe schools buildings have been destroyed. But then slowly, when we get to a point like nowadays in a protracted crisis in Syria, we also start investing and helping people invest a little more in their lives. And so instead of providing every year seeds to the same community of peasants, we start helping them over a period of 2-3 years to build a livestock. So then they can sell their products on a market and create a minimum of a value chain that does not only becomes economically more efficient because you don't have this annual input provision, but it gives them dignity because they feel they are self-reliant. They don't depend on you or somebody coming and handing them food. They can actually make their own living. And so this is the way we try in very practical terms to help people, particularly in those areas that now, luckily, haven't experienced major violent episodes for 3, 4, 5 years. Particularly in those areas, we know that some of these programs that help build self-reliance and micro-enterprises, small trades, small farming, and so on, we try to accompany that because there is a measure for responding to the basic needs and restitute a minimum of dignity for self-reliance. You know, people don't like to depend on others' assistance. Most of the people are happy to cater for themselves and for the needs of their families and communities.
You mentioned dignity, right to food, putting together classrooms. So my thoughts went immediately to human rights, to the 2030 UN agenda, which is a human right, people-centered agenda, but also, or unavoidably so, a human right-based agenda. And you mentioned healing from inside in order to absorb the shock and move on. So in terms of human rights, what do you think, most important for Syrians or other populations that have experienced such a shock, man-made pain, to heal and grow and move on in their journey? How is that possible?
You know, when we mention the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals, the tagline that is used also to promote this agenda is leaving no one behind.
That's true.
And basically, the pursuit of human rights, it's all about ensuring equal opportunities for everyone in the fulfillment of their basic rights. As we were mentioning before, a crisis brings a community backwards, or it stops its journey, this community's journey towards fulfilling the basic needs with dignity and in an equitable way. And so this is what is happening to countries like Syria and the other countries that currently have an active crisis. And therefore, in order to bring people and their needs and their dignity at the center of the agenda, of the political agenda, we need to first and foremost give them voices, making their voices heard, which is not always the case, because also the way media outlet describes areas of crisis and so on is often with the eye of create a sensation. Mm-hmm. And that does not necessarily reflect the full round situation. There are many people who are living with dignity, who are making an effort of pursuing their economic activities, who promote cultural initiatives as a form of remaining closely related to the identity, their past, their once again, the dignity of how their society used to carry itself before the crisis. And so helping people healing and promoting their rights mean being able at the same time to address all the aspects that touch on people's daily lives, from looking and finding a political solution to a dispute that has gone all the way into, as we mentioned, aggression and violence, but also at the same time accompanying people's legitimate wishes to wake up in the morning and feel safe, knowing that they're going to be able to eat a meal or two meals like we do and people in normal circumstances do, and then see a future for themselves. So having at the same time the responsibility to convene people and actors involved in the crisis and try to bring their vision and their focus onto the people needs makes a people-centered agenda that speaks about rights, because human rights are nothing but the translation into a normative agreement of those needs and the fulfillment, the ways towards the fulfillment of those basic needs. And so that's what we stand for as a multilateral system, promoting international cooperation.
Just before the pandemic hit the world about a year ago, one of the things we taught in our global studies classes was how the recent years had witnessed one of the biggest movements of people, migratory trends in history. That is kind of disputable. What is surely undisputable is people have traveled before, they've moved continents. What is surely undisputable is that rarely have so many people being forced to flee as in the past few years, as in the modern contemporary times. These people that are forced to flee, the refugees, as opposed to migrant workers or travelers or study abroad, very often they would like to return to their own countries. What are, do you think, the conditions that they put, or what do you know are the conditions that they put in order for them to return home? They don't travel voluntarily, they flee, literally, for safety.
Well, definitely, no. I will start from a consideration that seems common sense, but as we know, common sense is not that common anymore sometimes. Is that migration is neither a good thing or a bad thing.
Of course.
It's just a phenomenon, it happens. And so whatever motivates an individual or a group of people to flee from where they are needs to be addressed in order to try and create the conditions for people who are willing to go back to where they came from. Now, of course, for some people, even economic migrants sometimes are forced to leave or decide to leave to look for better opportunities that if they had equally promising opportunities around them would never consider to leave their place. Now, of course, when that migration happens because of violation of rights or because the exposure to a physical safety risk or security risk, addressing the causes of those migrations is more difficult because it requires rebuild something that got broken. It does not only require expanding the access to resources and opportunities, like in the case of those countries from where people leave just for looking for a better economic future. And so when we look at the causes of displacements out of countries in crisis, people will always ask to see the conditions prior to that crisis being reconstituted at a minimum in order to go back. And that's again is safety, physical safety, access to basic services. If I get ill, am I going to find a doctor or a clinic? Access to education for their kids, because nowadays in a knowledge-driven society, everybody is aware that education means opportunity for the future, and then a job to be able to cater for food and their basic needs. So then these four key factors may represent more or less of a priority for different groups who left different countries and different areas, but we will always find the four of these factors mentioned. And then they are accompanied by being able to return to their homes where homes have been destroyed or where their rights to property have been taken away. So then there are also very important rights that allow these four preconditions then allow people to build their lives on the foundation of these four preconditions. And so again, sometimes we just need to look at what we have and what we feel is essential in our lives and empathize with those who lost most of it or part of it and therefore had to leave where they used to have those conditions to flourish and fulfill their wishes. So I guess that's the biggest challenge as an international community, is to make sure that the conditions of living in dignity and equality are re-established in those places where something went wrong, so to say.
How many countries have you lived and worked in?
8 different countries, between countries where I studied and countries where I worked.
And where did you work exactly, or study?
The countries I worked for the United Nations in are the United States, Burkina Faso in Western Africa, Germany, the Netherlands, and now Syria.
And you studied abroad as well. You studied internationally. So what, in your experience, you've definitely studied and traveled the world and are ready to take off again. What would you say to your younger self or our young students? What is the added value of studying abroad and moving and studying abroad, really, coming to study in Italy?
I think that the most relevant element of studying and living abroad is that we get out of our habits and we ask questions, we get out of our social circles, and so we need to we end up challenging ourselves a little bit. And that helps discovering who we are, it helps discovering hidden resources we are not aware of, and it teaches us to rely on ourselves a little bit outside of our usual social pegs and create new ones. So it definitely opens the minds and makes us discover probably a wider range of opportunities than we think when we are children or teenagers in our community of origin.
That is true. Like, we get out of the comfort zone, and by that we are ready to eventually jump or walk in different paths that we might never have even thought of. Francesco, I want to thank you sincerely and thank you very much for having joined us today. I wish you, and in Rome especially, since you're always traveling, so we wish you safe travels back to Damascus, And I would like to invite you to come back to Rome, hopefully as a guest lecturer in one of our global studies class, so that instead of me asking questions, then next it will be our students asking you questions. But thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, and best of luck to your students in these difficult times.